Hi listeners and welcome to another Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm a hyper-real Chris Holiday.
My God, Chris. I don't know what that means, but in 10 minutes I will find out. So, hyper-realism. This is a term we've used on the podcast quite a few times, often in relationship to the Disney studio.
Yeah.
We haven't really done realism yet.
No.
So, in a way, to start off with, can you kind of give us a definition of both? What do we mean by hyper-realism, and why is that slightly different from just what we might mean by realism?
Well, that's a biggie.
I know.
Realism. Well, I was
Yeah.
always taught that realism, the definition of realism is a set of conventions that changes over time. As in, realism is something that is kind of quite abstract, and when we talk about realism, certainly with the animation context, that because of animation's rhetorical, enunciative kind of qualities, animation is often about realism because it's committing to an idea of what we think of as realistic. So when we encounter hyper-realistic painting, we're often thinking about painting that is absolutely realistic in the way that it matches up with our experience, but crucially the images that we see, it matches up with our experience of the real world and the kinds of images that we see. But realism in animation it can be tonal. You know, The Simpsons, the characters don't look realistic, but the situations, the content, the relationships is realistic. And you mentioned at the start kind of Disney hyper-realism, which is where I sort of settle with hyper-realism. A way in which realism is constructed as an effect within animation. So a lot of writing on realism and animation is that reality is an effect. This is constructed by pristine digital images, computer animation, or drawings or something.
So, I don't know, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but for the purpose of this discussion, would it be fair to say that if realism is when art or anything achieves a quality that we might go, oh, that seems real, or that looks real, whether that be a realistic conversation that happens on The Simpsons or a painting that seems to look like a photograph because it's drawn in such a way as to make it seem real. Yeah. But hyper-realism is almost when that's used as a moment of spectacle or a moment of visual pleasure, that it's pleasurable. That, you know, where's the hyper in the realism?
So I suppose there is a difference between how animation studies would use the term hyper-realism, which is very connected to the Disney studio.
Which we can come on to why.
Which will come on to that. But hyper-realism as itself, a genre, a style, an approach within painting, within sculpture, is actually used almost as an intensification of photorealism, which is another footnote that, depending on the ordering, will either be just before this or just after this. So I'll talk about photorealism then, but hyperrealism is normally considered to be an intensification of photorealism by creating a painting or a sculpture that is hyper-realistic to the point where there's an uncanny effect where you think, is this sculpture or painting something else? So is this painting actually a photograph? So you have these hyper-realistic paintings that are intended to look like photographs. To me, that would be quite close to photorealism, but
let's get onto that in another footnote. So hyper-realism. Realism is that looks relatively real.
Relatively
someone paints
authentic.
a picture of a tree, and you go, that looks like a tree. That has a quality of realism,
a quality of resemblance, whereby there's enough in the image to sort of go, that reads as authentic or realistic.
And hyper-realism would be, wow, that really looks like God, is that a tree out there? No, it's not a window, it's a painting. Let's do it. Okay, so why specifically is this used in relationship to the Disney studio then? Talk me through that.
Well, the Disney studio, and we've done a previous footnote on plasmaticness, that hyperrealism is an aesthetic category, but it's also, like plasmaticness, a political category, an aesthetic. It's a political, aesthetic, historical, and technological. So historically, hyperrealism is a phase that sort of comes after plasmaticness, but the break between those two eras is not necessarily clean. It's the moment where Disney makes quote-unquote realistic and authentic and believable looking cartoons across feature length, as well as some of the earlier silly symphonies, where the plasmatic fluency, flexibility of bodies is tempered somewhat by a realistic register that approximates the kind of codes and conventions of live action cinema. So Paul Wells, in his book Understanding Animation, talks about the principles of hyperrealism, that with every technological development, Disney kind of coerced animation into what he calls a neo-realistic practice. So after this period of kind of chaotic plasmaticness and bodies that resemble rubber hoses and fluid bodies and bodies that seem to have no fixed form, actually we get a series of movies, and Chris Pallant calls this period Disney formalism, where Disney honed its principles in illusionist representation and coerced the animated form into kind of a live action-y style whereby sound is realistic, i.e. the sound that footsteps make in the real world are the sound and the volume that footsteps make in an animated. So there's a kind of parallel in terms of the movement of the body, physical laws and gravity, sound. These are all not realism, they're hyper-realism, because animation can never obtain absolute realism because that would be absurd. So hyper-realism is almost a term that's used to talk about how Disney technologically, aesthetically, formally, and I think, kind of politically, the kind of political radicalism of plasmaticness has been seen to be kind of tempered and reduced by hyperrealism as a really standard. Realism is often in animation seen as the path of least resistance. Yeah, we could be experimental and creative and abstract and avant-garde, but actually Disney critiques are often at the charges leveled at realism that the studio and the man did to animation when it could have gone down the experimental visual music route of across Europe. Actually, what it did is that it kind of made Snow White look a lot like a live action movie in terms of shot arrangement. Right. And so hyperrealism is about animation's ability to be almost about realism. It's about physical laws, it's about sound and movement of the body. And Wells kind of defines hyperrealism according to these principles to sort of partition off some of that earlier plasmatic flexibility and chaos of Disney animation, uses it to then say, well, actually, no, this is the period, and this is why Pallant calls it Disney formalism. This is the moment where Disney honed its craft and created classical principles of illusionist composition, perspective and space, and things that are reading as authentic and realistic as we would understand it.
So is this a term that's being applied to the Disney studio retrospectively, or is this a term that the studio itself is using?
So, as with so many things, same with plasmaticness, it's not a term that exists in the industry. These are not animators they're not saying we need to make this the whatever the character in Pinocchio more plasmatic. It's not a term that exists in the industry. It's a term that exists in criticism and the spectator.
But there is a sense when you're talking about that move to Snow White, there is a sense that they are aware that they're doing something aesthetically realist, or they're looking to make Snow White look real, right?
Yes. So the rather than hyperrealism, what we need to do, I think, is think about Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston's book, The Illusion of Life, which is kind of been mythologized in some senses. And when we've had conversations with Disney directors and stuff, they're like, yeah, we don't really use the things that critics think we use. But there is this book from the early 80s, from 2 of the 9 old men animators, because there are gendered questions around labour at Disney in this time. But anyway, so The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation, which is essentially a manual that gives both a history of Disney animation but explains the processes by which, or a kind of production philosophy, a guidebook in how to replicate the 12 basic principles of animation which relate to character movement, things like squash and stretch, secondary motion. So if I throw a ball with my right arm, my left arm doesn't just sit there benignly, it does something. And all of these sort of aesthetic graphic principles are contained in this book that show us and tell us how Disney animators thought about their cartoons. So they didn't use the term hyperrealism as an industry label that was being passed around from different departments, from story to costume or whatever it is. But there is a sense in which the 12 principles of animation that are very famously introduced by Johnson and Thomas in the early 80s were the principles that the Disney animators were working to, a set of specifications that they were working to within the studio at the time.
Interesting. So, but even that's a retrospective looking back from them rather than a kind of self-conscious awareness at the time that they were doing anything different.
Yeah, it's funny because all the stuff on the book is, and the book kind of says that the principles are based on the work of Disney animators from the 1930s, and the contributions that these Disney's 9 old men, that include Johnston and Thomas, but also eminent people like Wolfgang Reitherman, Ward Kimball, Milt Kahl, Eric Larson. So they work on both short films and feature films, and they kind of constitute the animation department in this particular period, from the 30s up to the kind of 50s. And a brief little history tells me that Larson was the last to retire after his role on The Great Mouse Detective. So it kind of accounts for a 50-year period between the 30s and the 50s. So the book itself is retrospective. So there is a sense that this book is a kind of Bible of animation studies, or at least a production that is built from the contribution of people that were working in Disney in the 20s, but mostly the 30s, across short and feature-length films. And they were kind of guiding the illusionist properties of character and of background and of setting and perspective and all this sort of stuff. So you can read up about the illusion of life, but the illusion of life and the principles of animation are really about, I think, character movement and timing, and more related to the body, informed by physical laws and gravity and stuff like this. And
right, I would ask you at this point normally for a reading, but we're about short of time, and you've
just given it.
So to finish off, let me see if I can now explain. When you said to me about 10 minutes ago that you were feeling hyper-real, what you meant to say was that you were using a label to describe a term that implied that you not only felt connected to the real, but intensely commenting on, engaging with the real, that partially derives from a process that Disney went through in the 1930s when they moved from the kind of wacky slapstick of Mickey Mouse to the supposed realism of Snow White.
Yes.
Okay, well, I've got more questions about what that means about your mood, but for now, we'll call that a day. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.